like to welcome all of you to the 2016 G. Homer Durham Lecture. This lecture is sponsored by the Department of Political Science, along with the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences, and on behalf of them, I would welcome you and our special guest, Dr. Roger Porter, to this lecture, which is entitled Presidential Leadership in a Challenging Time. How should we measure the president? We'd like to have a special welcome for members of the Durham family who have traveled to be with us here today. G. Homer Durham had a distinguished career in education as well as church service. He received his PhD in political science from the University of California at Los Angeles, and then went on to teach political science at the University of Utah, where he had gone to school as an undergraduate. He was the first head of the university's political science department and later served as the academic vice president of the University of Utah. He went on to be the president of Arizona State for 9 years. After his presidency, he became the first commissioner and executive officer of the Utah system of higher education. After he retired, he was appointed as a member of the first quorum of the 70, where in 1981 he was called as a member of the presidency of the 70. In 1982, he became the church's 17th historian and recorder, a position he held until his passing in 1985. Elder Durham believed in education and devoted his life to it. He once said, "Our theology assumes that everyone should be educated to the optimum of their capacity." The word educate is here meant broadly to include all the means available in the world's cultures, formal or informal. The first Durham lecture was held at BYU in 1987 and was given by Elder Neil A. Maxwell. This lecture continues today on what would have been Elder Durham's 105th birthday to honor this great man's life and purpose. And it's my privilege to introduce to you today Dr. Roger Porter. Professor Porter is the IBM Professor of Business and Government and the Master of Dunster House at Harvard University, and a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Joining the Harvard Kennedy School faculty in 1977, he has served for more than a decade in senior economic policy positions at the White House, most recently as Assistant to the President for Economic and Domestic Policy from 1989 to 1993. He served as Director of the White House Office of Policy Development in the Reagan administration and as Executive Secretary of the President's Economic Policy Board during the Ford administration. He is the author of Presidential Decision Making, as well as the author or editor of several books on economic policy, including Efficiency, Equity, and Legitimacy, The Multilateral Trading System at the Millennium, and New Directions in Financial Services Regulation. An alumnus of Brigham Young University, Porter was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. He was a White House Fellow from 1974 to 1975 and received his MA and PhD degrees from Harvard University. He has received presidential appointments from each of the last 8 U.S. presidents, and currently serves as a member of the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. We are pleased to welcome Professor Porter, and I'm going to turn the time over to him.
Well, thank you, Sven, very much for that generous introduction. It is a privilege to return to this campus. This is now the 5th invitation I've received in the last 4 decades since I was a student here. It's always a pleasure to come. Students and faculty are invariably gracious and generous, and it's wonderful to walk along some of the same paths, although driving around this campus is much more complicated than when I was here as a student. I'm particularly pleased to join in honoring G. Homer Durham, a remarkable teacher, political scientist, university administrator, and ecclesiastical leader. I had the privilege of serving in the British mission with his son and namesake. George was already a leader by the time I arrived and had a reputation for brilliance, faithfulness, and modesty. Even in those formative years, George was focused on serving others and seemed very unconcerned about possessions and positions. As an undergraduate at BYU, I chaired what was called the Academic Emphasis Committee, which invited speakers from outside the university to campus. The late 1960s were a time of considerable turmoil on campuses across the country, and so one of the things we decided was to have a week on the American university, its problems and prospects. And we had a succession of speakers that week: the president of Gonzaga University, the president of the University of Minnesota, O. Meredith Wilson, the executive vice president at the University of Utah, Neil Maxwell, and the highlight of the week was an address by G. Homer Durham, who was at the time president of Arizona State University. President Durham was very gracious in accepting the invitation from our student group. He gave a sober, candid, and ultimately optimistic, cautiously optimistic address. He encouraged his listeners to take a long view, to exercise patience, and to accept constructive change. At lunch, he reflected on his experiences in the classroom and as a university administrator. And for those of us who were considering a career in academia, he proved to be a wonderful role model. So it's a delight for me to have the privilege of delivering a lecture in his honor. We're now in the midst of another presidential election. These are events which often imperil sound public policy. This is particularly true during a time of frustration and discontent. Let me offer an example to illustrate the point. One of the principal engines pulling the world down the path of prosperity for the last half century has been the growth of global trade. Global trade since the end of the Second World War has grown about 50 to 60% faster than the growth in the global economy. Every nation has benefited from this development, none more so than the United States. It has helped to fuel productivity growth, to stimulate innovation, and to improve standards of living. Indeed, since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been a great leader in this effort. Every president for the last 40 years has sought trade promotion authority to enable U.S. negotiators to engage successfully with their counterparts around the world. And since the establishment of the World Trade Organization 20 years ago, the number of member countries has now grown to 162, which makes it virtually impossible to conclude a multilateral round that gets 162 countries to all agree. So given the lack, after 8 successful rounds, the lack of a successful multilateral round in the last 20 years, trade hasn't stopped. People have formed regional trading blocs and bilateral agreements, and there have been just under 600 of those created over the last 20 years. The United States has been on the sidelines for much of this period of time. However, in this last June, by a vote of 286 to 138 in the House and 60 to 38 in the Senate, by huge bipartisan majorities, the President was granted trade promotion authority once again, so that the United States could conclude the Pacific Trade Partnership, which is the largest trade agreement of any of these regionals, covering 40% of global trade, and putting the United States potentially back in the driver's seat of setting the rules for world trade. What is astonishing is that both the leading Democratic Party candidates for president, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and the 2 leading Republican Party candidates at this stage, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, have now publicly voiced their opposition to this agreement. This is an agreement in which the United States has more to gain than any other country. It is an agreement that would restore the United States to the center of the global trading system. It's an agreement that economists of both political parties uniformly recognize as beneficial to the United States economically as well as geopolitically. And we're on the verge of potentially electing somebody who is willing to dispose of it. Well, we're getting a little ahead of the story. To understand how we should measure the president, it's useful to recall how we got started. At the Constitutional Convention, there was a great debate about whether we should have a president. There had been no president under the Articles of Confederation. And if so, what the presidency should look like. There was a deep skepticism on the part of most of the colonists about executive power. After winning their independence a decade before, states set out to establish their constitutions, and almost all of them, they had very weak presidents or governors who were subservient to the legislature. This experiment did not go well. And so in the summer of 1787, they determined that they couldn't stay on the path that they were on now successfully, and a new arrangement needed to be made. So when they gathered in Philadelphia in that long, hot summer in 1787, they had to decide several crucial questions. Should we have a president? Should it be a plural or a unitary president? What powers should the executive have? And how should they be elected? Skillfully led by Gouverneur Morris, a series of compromises were constructed that established a presidency that was singular in nature, that had the power to execute the laws, to propose legislation, and not least who would serve as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. Rather than be selected by the Congress or by the public, the device ultimately adopted to select the president was through an electoral college in which the various state legislatures would determine how the electors would be selected. The framers of the Constitution were deeply skeptical about the ability of individuals to exercise power wisely and carefully. They were concerned about a strong federal government that might impose conditions on states and reduce their power and authority. And as a result, they devised a set of institutional arrangements that systematically sought to divide and distribute and diffuse and fragment power, so that no single individual or institution would be in a position to exercise that power arbitrarily and capriciously. One way of determining intent is to examine language and context. Another is to look at the profiles of the people who were selected as president. What kinds of people and what kinds of backgrounds did the framers have in mind when they chose those early presidents? Well, the presence of George Washington loomed large over the Constitutional Convention. Those who gathered in Philadelphia recognized that if the Constitution was ratified, and if he was willing, George Washington would almost certainly be elected president. He was. Twice. Unanimously, both times. T.D. Breen's recent book, published last month, entitled George Washington's Journey, The President Forges a New Nation, tells the story of how Washington, after he was inaugurated in New York, traveled by coach to all 13 states, and through the force of his personality and his character, literally unified the country through showing respect and a vision for the new federal government. Well, during the first 4 decades of the new republic from 1789 to 1829, we had 6 presidents. They all had as their principal background experience in military, in the case of Washington, and diplomatic affairs in the case of the other 5. 4 had served as Secretary of State. The only 2 who had not held significant diplomatic posts abroad were Washington and Madison. Each of these presidents was trained in foreign policy, in negotiating treaties, and in charting the nation's role in the world. From 1824, the first time Andrew Jackson ran for president, until 1892, almost 3/4 of a century, the last time that Benjamin Harrison ran for president, there were only 3 elections in which one of the candidates of the 2 major political parties was not a general. We essentially elected generals during the 19th century. We looked heavily to those who had senior military experience: Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James A. Garfield, and Benjamin Harrison. During the 20th century, however, we've changed course. During this period of time, we have had 40 individuals since 1900 run for president as the candidate of one of the 2 major political parties. The overwhelming background of these individuals is that they had deep political experience in navigating government. 10 had served previously as vice president. 13 had served in the House of Representatives. 14 had served in the U.S. Senate. 17 had served as state governors. 2 had served as cabinet secretaries. 3 had served as justices. There were only 2 who did not have such a background: Dwight Eisenhower, who had lots of governmental experience and had been Supreme Allied Commander in the Second World War, and Wendell Willkie, who was a Democrat until 1939 and a delegate at Democratic Party conventions, and then became a Republican and won the Republican nomination in 1940 before he was decisively defeated by Franklin Roosevelt. He was a corporate lawyer and businessman. In short, if you look at whom we have selected in the last century or so, we have looked to people who have demonstrated experience and competence and capability in government service. Well, in examining how we should assess presidents, it seems to me that 3 developments are worth our taking into consideration: a set of political developments, a set of international developments, and a set of domestic developments. Let's turn to the political developments first. Since passage of the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution in 1951, which limited presidents to 2 terms, we have had 8 incumbent presidents choose to run for re-election. Of those 8, 6 of them, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, have been re-elected. Only 2 presidents who have sought re-election since the 22nd Amendment was passed, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush, were not re-elected. In short, we have moved into an era in which we have confirmed with second terms our incumbent presidents. At the same time, we have had a dramatic shift in what has been happening with respect to unified and divided government. Unified government, the same party in control of the White House and of both houses of Congress, during the first 70 years of the 20th century, was the case in 56 of those 70 years. In only 14 years was there some form of divided government. That is, 80% of the time we chose unified government. Since 1969 through 2017, because we know what the outcome is going to be until the new Congress and new president come into office in 2017. During that last 48 years, we have had divided government for 33 and a half and unified government for 12 and a half. That is 74% of the time, 3/4 of the time, we have now had divided government, and only 1/4 of the time we have had unified government. For whatever reasons, and we don't have time to explore those now, we have moved into an era of divided government. That's one set of considerations to keep in mind. Second set of considerations is what has happened internationally. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the newly independent United States focused inward. George Washington issued in 1793 his Proclamation on Neutrality, and in his farewell address warned the country against entangling alliances. During the 19th century, we determinedly avoided becoming enmeshed in Europe's wars while we acquired and settled a continent. During the 20th century, however, the United States, along with its allies, has engaged in advancing two fundamental ideas. One idea is the idea of democracy as the best way to organize political activity in a society. And the second is the idea of free enterprise as the best way to organize economic activity in a society. We ended up fighting 2 world wars, one of which involved defeating Nazi totalitarianism, and a long Cold War before the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1990. In short, the United States has been at the forefront of advancing the idea of democracy and the idea of free enterprise. In country after country, on continent after continent, given the choice, people have chosen to embrace some form of democracy and some form of free enterprise. The United States was at the forefront in establishing, at the end of the Second World War, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later the World Trade Organization, 3 of which are headquartered on U.S. soil. As the 20th century drew to a close, it was clear that the United States was the world's strongest military power, the largest national economy with the highest level of productivity, and the dominant cultural force in the world. In many respects, during the 20th century, the United States became the world's indispensable nation. Whether generating new ideas and innovations, or maintaining the peace, or simply serving as an example, the United States assumed a position of global leadership. The transportation and communications revolutions reinforced the reality that isolationism is no longer a viable option for the United States. Let me turn now to some domestic developments. Democracies struggle with the question of how to promote economic growth on the one hand, and how to divide up the pie on the other. Democracies debate about what share of time, effort, and energy to devote to economic growth, and how much to spend to achieve quality of life through public goods, like those affecting the environment and health and safety. During the last 80 years, we have sought dramatically in the United States to expand opportunity, an equality of opportunity rather than an equality of results. And we have also, along with other advanced industrial economies, established a safety net to provide security are a measure of security and stability to citizens with respect to health and employment and their retirement. These programs, often referred to as entitlement programs, which began in the mid-1930s, are financed largely through pay-as-you-go mechanisms. Social Security was adopted 80 years ago, Medicare and Medicaid 50 years ago. They were adopted with the best of intentions and using a set of assumptions with respect to two crucial elements. One, life expectancy, and two, the birth rate. And what has happened over these last 8 decades has been that the assumptions on which these programs were originally based have proven, happily, in the case of life expectancy, not to be accurate. I don't know about you, but the older I get, the happier I am that people are living longer. Not only, importantly, are people living longer, but they're living healthier, which is, in my view at least, equally important. These demographic trends, however, have contributed to a financing problem that has been solved thus far through massive borrowing. And this has led to a dramatic increase in public debt, a pattern that cannot continue indefinitely. This pattern, by the way, is not exclusive to the United States, but it is true in virtually every advanced industrial economy. Well, given these realities about our political system, about the way the world is in our time, and about these domestic developments, what should we look to with respect to the president? So let me invite you to begin by putting yourself in the place of the president and imagining what that would be like. It's a pretty daunting task. You're over a budget that spends $3.9 trillion. You are the commander-in-chief of our military forces, which number about 1.4 million, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, and a little over 2 million federal civilian employees. You preside over an executive branch of the government that is responsible for in excess of 1,000 federal programs. It's a big job. I discovered how big it was late during my first stint in the White House, when I had the opportunity to spend some time with President Ford. He did something that I'm not aware any other president has done before or since, and that is during the closing 2 weeks of his presidency, he invited people who had served in his cabinet or in senior White House positions in to have 15 minutes with him and let him thank them for what they had done and them to thank him for the privilege of doing that. And I was fortunate enough to have one of these meetings with him. I remember it well. We were sitting in the Oval Office, and I determined to use this as an opportunity to pose to him a question that I would be fascinated in his response. I said to him, "What is it that surprised you most about being president?" Now, remember, this was a man who had spent 25 years in the House of Representatives, serving Congress longer than any president in U.S. history. He'd been vice president for 8 years. He had worked closely with Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon. This was not a man who had just wandered in from the prairie to Washington, D.C. And he looked at me and he said, I remember he motioned with his right hand toward the desk, which is on the other end of the Oval Office. And he said, "I had no idea the number of decisions and the magnitude of those decisions that I would be expected to make." So if you're president, and you're going to be expected to make large numbers of decisions. And these are not the easy decisions. The easy decisions all get made down below. The decisions that you have to make as president are the ones that are contested, where there are good arguments for going down one path or another. And therefore, one of the most important ways in which we should measure presidents is the people with whom they choose to surround themselves and the way in which they organize those people to ensure that three things happen. Number one, that they make what I like to call informed decisions. An informed decision is a decision in which at the time you make the decision, you have had presented to you in a form which you can understand all of the relevant information and analysis that is available at that time. If you were to discover 3 or 4 months later a piece of information that, had you known that at the time you made your decision, would have caused you to make a different decision, and if that piece of information was available at that time, then you made an uninformed decision. I'm not saying there's a perfect correlation between wise decisions and informed decisions, but I think the correlation is very high. So one task for this advisory system that assists the president in making his decisions is to ensure that he is making informed decisions. Secondly, however, decisions do not automatically implement themselves. Once a policy is established, there are a whole stream of implementing decisions that follow. And a second test for a decision-making system is, are the people who are going to be engaged in making the series of implementing decisions participants in fashioning that policy, familiar with it, and capable of making implementing decisions that are, in fact, consistent with the intent of the decision maker. Then there's a third test. And the third test is that you want to ensure, as best you can, that you avoid making mistakes. As doctors are told, first, do no harm. And this requires that presidents select people who are willing to tell them when they think they are making mistakes and provide an opportunity for those voices to be heard. Last week, I was having a fascinating conversation with a good friend, Ryan Crocker, who was serving in Iraq as our ambassador in Baghdad at the time of the transition from President Bush to President Obama. And on the first day in office, and President Obama insisted that it be held on the first day of office, he held a teleconference with his advisors in Washington and Ambassador Crocker and General Ray Orellano, who was the military commander there. This was typically a weekly conference, and President Obama determined he wanted to hold it, continue to hold them each week. There's a lot of continuity between administrations. People are often totally unaware of how much government just continues to roll on, whoever is in office. But President Obama said he wanted to hold this meeting on the very first day. As Ambassador Crocker got ready to make his presentation, President Obama put his hand up and, according to Ryan Crocker, said, "Before you start, I have one thing I want to say. I don't want to screw this up." He was saying implicitly, I am looking to you, those of you who are on the ground, who are experienced, who are there, to let me know if I am about ready to make a mistake. Presidents need to give those who are advising them permission to let them know when they think they are making a mistake. Well, there's several dangers that one wants to avoid in any advisory process. One danger and this is a very commonplace danger, is that for reasons of secrecy or confidentiality, you circumscribe the number of people who are involved. And in doing so, you often end up inadvertently excluding important viewpoints or having particular perspectives not adequately included and addressed. The second danger, however, is the danger of what Irving Janis, the psychologist, refers to as groupthink, that you develop a set of norms that those who are participating in them feel bound and constricted by, so that in fact you don't have the full and free discussion that one wants to have in a process that is designed to produce informed decisions. Presidents need to have people help draw for them a map as accurate as possible and as detailed as possible of substantive and political reality. They need to know the consequences of what is going to happen or likely to happen if you go down path A or B or C, and they need to have confidence in knowing the outlines of political reality, who will be with them, who will be against them, how much political capital they will have to expend if they are going to go down those respective paths. So let me share with you an experience that I hope will help illuminate the point. Most presidents, when they come into office, feel like they've been dealt a difficult hand. When is the last time we had a president who said, "Oh my gosh, it's so good. I just hope I don't make any mistakes because it doesn't really get better than this"? No, most presidents feel like they've been dealt a difficult hand. The first president I worked closely with, Gerald Ford, was no exception. He came into office in the wake of the worst political scandal we had had in our history. Confidence and trust in government had fallen to an all-time low. We were mired in a highly unpopular war halfway around the world. And in addition to that, a year before, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries had formed and had imposed a 6-month embargo on oil shipments to the United States, prompting us to launch Project Independence, how we were going to free ourselves from these uncertain foreign sources of oil. During the 3 months before he became president, the wholesale price index, we now refer to it as the producer price index, but it leads the consumer price index by about 5 months, was increasing at an annual rate of 37%. This was the most explosive outburst of inflation in United States history. Well, on December 27th, I remember the day well because it was 2 days after Christmas, President Ford convened a meeting of his economic and energy advisors in Vail, Colorado, where he was spending the holidays, to discuss what he would propose in his first State of the Union address the third week of January. Now, I don't know what you think these meetings are like. A lot of people reason in their minds, well, just a second. Who is going to be in these meetings anyway? Well, they're going to be people whom the president selects. Who is the president going to select to be in meetings? Well, he's going to select people who are very much like himself in the way in which they think. So if you were in the meeting and a fly on the wall and you could hear the conversation, the reasoning goes that the differences of opinion would be, in fact, fairly narrow because it's a group of people who are effectively cut out of the same cloth. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. That first day, we started at 8 in the morning. We went straight through without a break until noon. We took a break at noon till 1 o'clock, resumed at 1, and went till 5:15. I remember it well because I was the note taker and my hand was just exhausted from taking notes. We went through issue after issue after issue. The debates were fierce. People are polite, and they don't get personal in these kinds of discussions, but the divisions were stark and the advice was widely varied. 5:15, the president put up his hand and said, "Thanks, it's been a long day. Appreciate very much your coming. We would like to invite you over to the chalet that we are renting for a buffet supper." I remember he used the term supper. Many of us refer to the evening meal as dinner, but he referred to it as supper at 7 o'clock. So 7 o'clock arrived. We made our way from where we were staying to there. I was by far the youngest person there, for about 25 years younger than anybody else, and so I decided that if anybody was not going to be included in the big meeting the next day when all the decisions would be made, it would be me, so I would be on my best behavior. I would not get in line in front of everyone. I would be the last person through the buffet. There are advantages as being the last person through a buffet because you're not taking food out of the mouths of the hungry, which means that I got my plate. Like most of us, I love to eat, and this was no exception. And I had my plate full of food, and I turned around and looked for a place in this small room to sit down, and there was only one empty seat left in the room, and it was at a table for 4 next to the president. And the first thought that went through my mind is, I can't go over there and sit down. People are going to think, who does this kid think he is? And I started to back up and ran into the wall and said to myself, well, I can't just stand here and eat. I mean, people are going to think, boy, he's really weird, isn't he? What's going on? And so you think everybody's watching you, which they're not, but the next thought that went through my mind is, well, look, everybody can see that I don't have any choice. It's the only empty seat left. So I start walking across the room, and your mind is racing. What do I talk to him about? University of Michigan football, the Rose Bowl game, which was coming up. And then I said to myself, when am I going to have another opportunity like this? Maybe never. This might be my last supper. And so I walked across the room, sit down. About 5 minutes later, he finishes his conversation with the person on his other side, and he turns to me, and we did talk about the Rose Bowl and University of Michigan football. But then I summoned up my courage, and I said, and you can only do this really easily when you're young and people are prepared to believe you're somewhat naive. And I said, Mr. President, if you don't mind my asking, what did you think of today's discussions? And he said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, do you find the kind of discussion that we had today helpful to you as a decision maker? Now, you had to be in the discussion. I mean, people were just tearing into one another. And he turns to me and he smiles and he said, I loved it. He said, I've discovered in this job that there are many people eager to tell you what they think you want to hear, and very few people willing to tell you what they think you need to know. And today, I heard from a lot of people telling me what they think I need to know. I then said, well, Mr. President, have you decided what you're going to do? And he smiled and said, no, I want to think about it overnight, and I'm going to give everybody the opportunity to speak again tomorrow. But I do know this, whatever I decide, they'll all support it. I turned to him and I said, Mr. President, how can you be so confident that they will all support it? And he said, and this is a direct quote, because I'm giving them all the opportunity to take their best shot. Well, the next day, we spent 8 hours in meetings. We went through 18 major decisions, options papers that we had prepared during the weeks leading up to it. He made decisions. When I interviewed all of the people later for a book that I wrote about his style of decision-making, in one way or another, they all used some form of the term, he gave us all the opportunity to take our best shot. Presidents have a lot of control over the kinds of people that they surround themselves with, whom they choose to listen to, and the extent to which they encourage those people to give them their candid advice. Now, I have done a terrible job of managing time, so I'm going to race through the last few observations about what we should do with respect to measuring our presidents. As I think I've already made it clear, we do not have a choice to turn to be an isolationist country like we were in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. Joseph Nye has written recently a fascinating book entitled Presidential Leadership and the Creation of the American Era. And he looks at how the presidents since the end of the Second World War have conducted foreign policy. Let me give you a little thought experiment to consider. Take any 4-year period since the end of the Second World War and ask yourself, at that moment in time, how easy or difficult is it to predict the major issues that the president will be expected to decide in foreign policy over the next 4 years? It's very difficult. It is extraordinarily difficult to predict the future. As a result, you need a president who is adaptable, who has experience, because as we have all learned, when you're going into a venture the first time, you make more mistakes than you do after you have acquired some experience. In the world of foreign policy, you not only need a lot of experience with respect to the people around you, but you are having to deal with large numbers of people abroad. And the relationships that you have or do not have with them, the network of relationships that you have developed, and whether or not they trust you is absolutely crucial. Consider the best prepared president in foreign policy that we have had in this period of time, George H.W. Bush, who had been ambassador to the United Nations, our liaison to the People's Republic of China, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, vice president of the United States for 8 years, all before he became president. Look at the decisions that he had to make. How do we respond to Tiananmen Square in China? Do we use it to isolate the Chinese or to engage them with the world? What are we going to do with respect to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the seemingly apparent collapse of the Soviet Empire? What are we going to do with respect to the issue of the unification of Germany, which Helmut Kohl wanted deeply and Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand and Mikhail Gorbachev did not want? Or at least Gorbachev didn't want it as long as they were going to be a part of NATO. He was quite happy to have a neutral Germany, but not in the midst of NATO. The invasion on August 4th of 1990 by Saddam Hussein of Kuwait. And think of the kinds of experience and network that the president had that enabled him to guide policy through those difficult and challenging decisions remarkably. I'll have to close with this one, but I was at a dinner up at Kennebunkport. This would have been about, 8 or 9 years ago. It was a small dinner. The guest was former Prime Minister John Major from the United Kingdom. And after the meal was served and we were eating dessert, former President Bush said to him, John, would you be willing to share some remarks with us? He said, sure. And he said, the United States is the most powerful nation in the world. Indeed, the United States is more dominant than any nation has ever been including Rome at the height of the Roman Empire. He went on, I have had the opportunity to interact with leaders all around the world during my years as Prime Minister. I do not know a single one who could have put together the broadest coalition, broader than the coalition in the First World War, broader than the coalition in the Second World War, broader than the coalition in the Korean War, that President Bush put in place in the first Gulf War. Why was he able to put it together so skillfully and successfully? The answer, he said, is because all the people whom he dealt with knew him and trusted him. Well, I immediately went back to my room and wrote everything down that I could remember. And I thought, yeah, this is too good. I want to use this in a lecture. So I sent an email to President Bush, and I said, this is what I remember from the conversation last night. Can you confirm it? Did I get it roughly right? And later that afternoon, I get an email back from him, and he said, I sent your email to Prime Minister Major, and he just sent it back and said, I couldn't have said it any better, and I would be happy to have him use it. I was going to use it in my first lecture that year, and of course I teach on the American presidency. We need presidents who have the capacity to make wise decisions, who are willing to surround themselves with people and utilize a process that's going to help them to make informed decisions. We also need presidents who are prepared and willing to lead the country as commander-in-chief and as the architect of the nation's foreign policy. And those are considerations worth taking into account as we consider a new president. Thomas Huxley, the British essayist, laid a charge before the American people that is worth considering when he wrote, I cannot say I am in the slightest degree impressed by your bigness and your material resources as such. Size is not grandeur, and territory does not make a nation. The great issue upon which hangs a true sublimity and the terror of overhanging fate is, what are you going to do with all these things? Well, it's to the president that we look to help us as a nation in devising an answer to that question of what are we going to do with all these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. We will just dismiss now. There's another class that will need to be coming in here, and the luncheon will be held for those attending the luncheon in the Hinckley building on the main floor, right? The main floor auditorium. Thank you.